The San Francisco 49ers quietly dropped a major update that not many people are talking about, but it could end up being one of the most important pieces of news for the team's future. We're talking about Nick Bosa and Mike Williams, and the fact that both of them are expected to be back around training camp. This is huge because we are essentially talking about both starting defensive ends returning to full health on a similar timeline. That's not just good news. It's a complete shift in how you can look at the defense heading into next season. Nick Bosa is one of those players that you simply cannot overstate the impact of. The guy doesn't just make plays, he elevates the entire defense around him. It is a classic rising tide lifts all boats scenario, and Nick Bosa is the tide. When he's on the field, everyone else seems to play faster, harder, and smarter. So hearing that he's on track to be back for training camp is a massive deal. If the 49ers can get him and Mike Williams back and healthy at the same time, it changes everything. Suddenly, the pass rush is not something you hope for. It becomes something you can rely on. Now, let's talk about Alfred Collins. He suffered a shoulder injury against Seattle, and it may require surgery. What's interesting is that this happened 4 days ago, and we still don't know for sure whether surgery is needed. That's a pretty long period of uncertainty for a player who is still trying to establish himself in the rotation. The fact that we're still waiting on a definitive answer says a lot about how complex the injury could be. And yet, at the team dinner, he looked perfectly fine. That was one of those moments where you're like, okay, he seems okay, but then you remember he might still be dealing with something significant. It's one of those situations where the outward appearance doesn't always tell the full story. On the injury front, Nick Martin was cleared from concussion protocol today, and that's a relief because his time away went on for a really long stretch. You don't want to see players taking too long to recover from concussions, but at least this is a good sign that he's back in the clear. Another big update is that the 49ers have been looking into the electrical substation situation, reaching out to anyone and everyone to see if a study exists. Now, I'm not going to dive deep into any conspiracy theories about electrical substations or try to turn this into a tinfoil hat moment. The important part is that the 49ers are doing their due diligence and taking it seriously. They're not brushing it off, and that's what matters right now. John Lynch opened the press conference with a major commitment to players' safety and health. He made it clear that the team is turning over every stone to figure out the injury situation and do whatever it takes to protect their players. And I think a lot of fans are going to hold him to that. Because let's be honest, the 49ers have had far too many seasons where injuries have been a recurring nightmare. There have been a few exceptions, but the overall pattern has been grim. And the fans have been watching that for years now, hoping that something finally changes. Now, I will say this. Some of the injuries the team has dealt with were not necessarily training-related. Nick Bosa's in-game injury and Fred Warner's injury, for example, were not exactly the kind of thing you can blame on the training staff. George Kittle is another case where you could argue a bit about the injury situation, but overall, it's hard to say that it was entirely the team's fault. The tricky part is that his entire career has been with the 49ers, so you can't completely separate the two. It's a tough discussion because on one hand, injuries happen. On the other hand, the organization has to take responsibility for the pattern over time. When it comes to Mike Williams, I think his situation is similar to Bosa and Warner. It feels like something that happened in a game, not necessarily something that came from training. I don't see it as a toughness issue or a training issue. It just seems like an unfortunate injury in the flow of the season. Now, Ricky Pearsall is a different story. Some fans believe he is injury-prone, and the argument for the team being responsible there is that he may have been allowed to come back too soon. He did end up missing a lot of time. It felt like every week there was another setback. It was a long, drawn-out process where it kept being delayed. So, there is some legitimacy to the idea that the team could have managed that situation better. But the broader pattern that fans point to is the soft tissue injuries, those nagging injuries where players are constantly up and down. You see it with guys like Tatum Bethune, who seems to get hurt, come back, and then get hurt again. Those are the kinds of injuries where you can start to question the training and recovery protocols. And that's why it matters so much that the 49ers are now saying they're going to be aggressive and thorough in addressing the problem. It suggests they might be looking not only at how injuries happen, but also at whether the staff and the process are built to prevent them. After 2 seasons of brutal injury history, it is fair to say that the 49ers need to handle this more aggressively. And for what John Lynch said, it feels like he understands that. If he is serious about this commitment, then we should see some real changes in how the organization approaches player health. It's not just about finding a quick fix. It's about building a culture and a system that keeps players healthy for the long haul. As someone who creates content and follows every interview and update, I can tell you it has been exhausting. It feels like for 4 days out of every week, everything is centered around injuries. Monday's interviews, Tuesday with nothing, Wednesday and Thursday with injury updates, and then Friday with the final update. It becomes this constant loop where you're just waiting to hear who is practicing and who isn't. It shouldn't be that way. The focus should be on football, on strategy, on development, not just on whether the team is going to be healthy enough to compete. That's a problem, and it's something the organization needs to fix. Now let's switch gears and talk about the free agent situation, because that is where the 49ers really have to start making some tough decisions. One name that came up is Jawan Jennings. John Lynch was asked about him and basically said, "We'd love to have him back. We'll see how it goes." And honestly, that line felt like the most uncertain of all the potential returnees. It sounded like the kind of response you give when you want to be respectful, but you don't really expect it to happen. It felt like GM speak if I've ever heard it. Like, we love the guy, but we might not be able to keep him. And that's the tough part because Jennings is one of those players you really don't want to lose. He's not just a role player. He's a culture guy. He's the kind of receiver who understands a system, understands the offense, and is reliable in the way that matters. He's not a superstar, but he is a steady presence who can come in and make a play when needed. He's also one of the hardest blockers at his position, and that kind of effort sets the tone for the rest of the receiving core. If you lose a guy like that, it's not just losing a player. It's losing a piece of the team's identity. The 49ers have already let go of culture players in recent years, like Dre Greenlaw and Talanoa Hufanga. These are guys who were pillars of the team, who brought toughness and energy every single week. Losing them hurts in ways that don't always show up on the stat sheet. And Jennings is very much in that same category. He brings a certain mentality to the locker room, and that's something you don't replace easily. So when you hear the team say, "We'd love to have him back," it's hard not to feel like that might be a goodbye. Kyle Shanahan did mention that they want to re-sign Eddie Pearson, and of course that makes sense. He was a rock this season, and keeping the kicking unit intact is important. Thomas Morstead and John Weeks are also mentioned as guys they want to keep if possible, and that's fair. You don't want to mess with the chemistry of the special teams if it's working. The kicking crew has been solid, and continuity there matters. But the bigger question is who the 49ers will bring back on offense and defense, and whether they will prioritize familiarity or look for upgrades. Now, let's talk about the defensive coordinator situation, which is a big one. Robert Saleh leaving creates a ripple effect that most fans haven't really considered yet. Kyle Shanahan brought up a very important point. Saleh is likely going to request interviews with current 49ers staff members to bring them to Tennessee. And that's completely normal. It happens all the time in the NFL. But when you stop and think about it, it's a huge deal. You don't just lose the coordinator. You lose the staff and the coaches who make the system run. That's why it might be crucial for the 49ers to promote people like KJ right before they get poached. He's a highly respected coach who has worked with some of the best linebackers in the league. You see him at events like the Senior Bowl, and you can tell he has a reputation around the league. If the 49ers want to keep the staff intact, they have to be proactive. You can't wait until guys start getting calls. You have to make them feel valued and show them a path to advancement within the organization. Otherwise, you risk losing the people who are the backbone of your defense. When it comes to the internal candidates for defensive coordinator, Gus Bradley is the obvious one. He is the main internal candidate, and it makes sense because he's been a key part of the defensive structure for a while. But Kyle Shanahan also made it clear that the search will include external candidates. They're going to cast a net, talk to people, and go through the league requirements. That's standard procedure, but it also suggests that they are not going to rush into a decision. They want to make sure they find a right fit, and that could mean looking beyond the obvious names. Speaking of external candidates, Richard Sherman weighed in on the situation and mentioned Jim Schwartz. Schwartz is a name that a lot of fans are interested in, and Sherman said that if Schwartz doesn't get the job with the Browns, Kyle Shanahan will throw everything he has at him to try to bring him to San Francisco. That would be a huge move because Schwartz is a proven defensive mind who has been successful in multiple places. Another name mentioned is Raheem Morris, who is also someone the 49ers may have conversations with. Those are the kind of names that make you think the 49ers are serious about keeping the defense at a high level. One thing that is important to note is that Brian Flores is no longer available. He signed a new contract with the Minnesota Vikings, which is great for them, but not what 49ers fans wanted to hear. Flores was one of those coaches who could have been a sneaky great fit for the organization, and it would have been interesting to see what he could do in San Francisco. But now he's locked in with Minnesota, so the 49ers have to look elsewhere. Now, shifting back to one of the biggest stories in the offseason, the Brandon Aiyuk situation. This has been talked about nonstop across the internet, and there are a few new details that have come to light. John Lynch was asked about the situation, and he basically said he wishes he knew what happened. He admitted he didn't have an explanation, and he was pretty clear about it. He also confirmed that it's safe to say Aiyuk has played his last snap with the 49ers, which is something we all already knew, but hearing it confirmed still hits differently. What was interesting is that Lynch started to say he would look at what the team could have done differently, and then corrected himself mid-sentence to say what he could have done differently. That was a small moment, but it was meaningful because it sounded like he was taking a little personal responsibility for how the situation played out. And that's not something you hear often in the NFL. It was a rare moment of accountability, and it made you wonder if there is more to the story behind the scenes. We all know that Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch had a role in the decision to keep Aiyuk instead of trading him when the opportunity was on the table. Shanahan famously ran up the stairs to make sure the team kept him, and at the time, you could understand why. Aiyuk is an unbelievable talent, but clearly something was not right. And I'm not going to speculate about mental health or anything like that, because none of us know what's going on. But it is obvious that something was off. But before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to 49ers Zone and hit the like button on this video. Your support helps us keep bringing you the latest updates on the San Francisco 49ers. And don't forget to share your thoughts on the news in the comments below. Whispers are growing louder around Santa Clara, and the latest comments attributed to Nick Bosa have poured gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering inside the 49ers locker room. What was supposed to be a routine media session suddenly felt like a public airing of dirty laundry, with the star pass rusher pointing fingers and drawing a clear line between units. When Bosa suggested that the defense had done its job while others gave it away, it didn't sound like a simple moment of frustration. To many around the league, it sounded like the first crack in a locker room that may already be fractured. Sources close to the team insist that tension has been building for weeks, particularly between veteran defenders and an offense struggling to find rhythm. The defense, packed with high-priced talent and prideful personalities, reportedly feels it has carried the team on its back, only to watch momentum slip away due to mistakes on the other side of the ball. Bosa's words, whether intentional or not, echoed what some teammates have allegedly been saying behind closed doors. Inside the building, the concern is less about one comment and more about what it represents. Coaches often preach, "We win together, we lose together," but that message becomes harder to sell when frustration turns public. League insiders speculate that younger offensive players may feel singled out, while established leaders could interpret the criticism as a challenge rather than motivation. In that environment, silence can be just as loud as confrontation. For an organization built on unity and toughness, the idea of a split locker room is unsettling. Some believe this is simply a heat-of-the-moment reaction that will fade with time. Others warn that once blame enters the conversation, it rarely leaves quietly. Whether Bosa's remarks become a rallying cry or a turning point toward deeper unrest remains to be seen. What is clear is that the 49ers are no longer just battling opponents on the field, but also the growing perception of a team wrestling with itself. That's it for this update. If you enjoyed the video and want to keep receiving exclusive news about the San Francisco 49ers, make sure to subscribe to 49ers Zone and give this video a like. We always look forward to hearing your comments and opinions. See you in the next video.